Hello, America. I'm Mark Levin. This is Life, Liberty, and Levin. We have a great guest, Speaker Newt Gingrich.
Good to be with
How are
you.
sir?
Good.
It's a pleasure. Whole hour.
Yeah,
How often do you get that?
not very.
Well, I don't need to introduce you. Everybody knows who you are. But I want to talk first, before we get into the election, because I think it's a crucial election. There are certain issues I want to talk about, certain candidates I want to talk about, the media and so forth. But before we do, I think a little background is useful. You're a historian, and Donald Trump, I would argue, is one of the most conservative presidents we've had in modern history. Now, he may not be a conservative, based on philosophy, but I think he's a conservative as a result of common sense and his background as a developer and so forth. But also, it's part of a trajectory. Explain this trajectory over the last several decades of conservatism and conservative victories.
Well, what had happened was that the Roosevelt-era Democrats created the modern system, big bureaucracies, centralized power, a whole set of values, compounded by Eisenhower making a huge mistake in appointing Earl Warren and leading to a much more radical court than anybody had imagined. So by the early 1960s, you had a reaction building in the country that said government's too big, our policy against the Soviet Union is too weak, taxes are too high, and frankly, we don't want Washington running our lives. The guy who personified that was Barry Goldwater, and he wrote a little book called Conscience of a Conservative, which came out in paperback, and I was a college student at the time, and it just swept the country. I mean, it really created a whole generation of Goldwater supporters who really saw him sort of personifying a new way of thinking about things. He was very important because he broke the establishment's grip on the Republican Party. He lost badly in the general election to Johnson, who probably was going to win anyway because John F. Kennedy had been assassinated and we weren't going to change presidents twice that quickly. But Goldwater sort of planted the flag, and ironically, in defeat, he asked Ronald Reagan to make a nationwide speech in October of '64. And so, in a way, the conservative flag was passed from Barry to Ronnie at that moment. Reagan's speech was electrifying, and he went on to become governor of California. And I would argue that there's a continuum that starts with Goldwater, goes to Reagan, that in many ways, Nixon and all the traditional Republicans are placeholders, just as later on the Bushes would be placeholders. Because they don't actually understand the long-term trajectory of conservatism. Reagan comes along, ultimately becomes a very consequential president in three ways: defeating the Soviet Empire, which is an enormous achievement, one of the great strategic victories of all time because he did it without a war, relaunching the American economy, getting people to feel good about being entrepreneurs, and really focused on American civic culture. And in fact, in his farewell address, he says one of his great sadnesses was that they had not driven home American history enough. But he was trying to rebuild the sense of being American. You then have a period that we're in the doldrums, and we come along with the contract with America, and for the first time in 40 years, the Republicans win the House. We impose a balanced budget for 4 straight years. We impose welfare reform. We have a number of other reforms. Bill Clinton actually comes to the Congress and with a straight face says, the era of big government is over. I mean, it was really a pretty remarkable moment. And led scars on the left, which Hillary never overcame. I mean, there are a lot of liberals who hated what the Clintons did. And then we again sort of had a period of being in the doldrums and following some policies that frankly didn't work. I mean, look, I was for the war in Iraq. And I certainly was for the war in Afghanistan. But you have to look 17 years later and say, we haven't figured out how to win these things. And along comes Trump. And I agree with you about describing Trump. And as you and I talked about earlier off camera, you have the Tea Party movement begin to explode around 2010 because they couldn't grow up against a Republican president, but they could rapidly mobilize against a Democratic president. And so you have a whole new wave of energy. John Boehner and the House Republicans actually won 10 more seats in 2010 than I won in 1994.
63 seats?
63 seats.
You got 54 seats.
Yeah. And Boehner did it with a very straightforward, simple campaign. Where are the jobs? And it just worked. I mean, it came together. People looked up and said, that's the right thing, that's the right question. And so we were back in charge of the House again. And I think people today have no idea how unusual this is, that we held the House for two-year terms between 1930 and 1994. So out of 64 years, we held the House for 4 years. We've now held the House the vast majority of the time since 1994. And along comes Trump, and I agree with you. I tell people, I'm not sure he's a conservative, but he's the most effective anti-liberal in my lifetime. And whether it's deregulation or conservative judges or cutting taxes or standing up for an American foreign policy based on American values, every time you turn around, he is instinctively saying things which drive the left crazy. And he's doing it, I think, because of this notion of common sense and the things he learned a long time ago. Again, he's old enough. He remembers the values of the post-World War II, highly patriotic America, where people, loved the flag and they loved the idea that we were the greatest nation on earth, and they loved the values of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And so in a lot of ways, he's carrying forward, almost as a grandfather, the values of 2 generations ago and taking head on the left-wing radical values which the academic world, the news media, and Hollywood have tried to impose on the country.
And yet it seems to me, Newt, that he wasn't always this way. It wasn't always coming toward a conservative conclusion. He had a background as a Democrat, as a Reform Party supporter. He backed some liberals. And I think, as he's been president, that these things have crystallized for him. That sitting there, where the buck stops there, and seeing these policies, seeing the impact of these policies or potential impact of the left's policies, using his common sense and using his business background and so forth, and he's an incredibly intelligent man, and he's sitting there and saying, no, that's not right. And when you really think these things through, he comes, and many people come, to a more conservative perspective.
I think that's partly true, but I think the Donald Trump between 1983 or 4 and as early as the 80s, Oprah Winfrey's asking him if he's going to run for president. He's a very young guy at that point. That Donald Trump, I think, was stunningly shallow and was sort of for whatever we're for, because, that's what we're doing. And gradually began to change. And I think that it is watching Obama that drove him to the right. Because it was just clear in a sense, Bush and the failure to win in Iraq and Afghanistan drove him into a harsh critique of American foreign policy. And Obama's entire approach to policy drove Trump to just say, this is crazy. I remember years ago I had the opportunity to spend time with the founder of Singapore, who had been the great leader who created a remarkably successful country. And I asked him, what was the base of what he did? And he said, I was a graduate student in Britain during the Labour government right after World War II. And every time I would encounter a problem, I'd ask myself, what would Clement Attlee and the socialists do? And I would do the exact opposite. And it worked every time. And I think in a sense, Trump came out of the Obama years having been driven to a much more practical businessman, common sense approach. And because he wanted to run as a Republican, he began to acquire allies like Dave Bossie and others who were naturally in the conservative movement. Sean Hannity is probably in some ways, ironically, his closest advisor in that period. You can't do the Hannity show once or twice a week and not gradually become a conservative, because it just doesn't work. And then I remember Clista and I were in the meeting here in Washington, his first visit to Washington as a candidate, where we're sitting around and people, your point, people kind of going, is this guy a total opportunist? Why would I believe him? And somebody in the group came up and said, why don't we put together a list of 10 solid conservatives that you would name to the Supreme Court, so that people can realize here's stability, here's a clear commitment, it's a yes or no. And Leonard Leo and Jim DeMint of the Heritage Foundation agreed to take the lead, and Leonard Leo, who's the head of the Federalist Society. And that's one of the big changes, I think, because we now have relationships that we didn't have 30 years ago. You couldn't have produced the number of judges for Reagan that they're now producing for Trump.
And this came, by the way, out of the Reagan administration. sort of the farm team
Right.
became the team. Federalist Society, the Heritage Foundation, many of the people who are being pointed to the bench worked at the Justice Department,
That's right.
or worked in U.S. attorneys' offices under Reagan, under Meese, and they developed this whole farm team.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And so Trump, because he was running as a Republican, and because he has no hostility to conservatism, it's just he doesn't think about it much. And he has enormous hostility to political correctness and liberalism, because it just doesn't fit how he thinks the world works. And so I think we ended up with somebody who I compare, frankly, to Andrew Jackson as one of the most disruptive presidents we've ever had, because he's not afraid to take on the establishment every single morning.
And we need a disruptive president, don't we?
Absolutely. It would have been, I think, if we had had a Reaganite follow Reagan in '88, we might have been, in fact, gotten to where we are today a generation earlier. But it was very hard to break out of the establishment. That's why you have the Never Trump movement, because these are people who are just paralyzed at the idea that their little world is disintegrating and that this brand new populist conservative world is overwhelming them.
And because he is a disruptor, in a positive sense, the people who don't like being disrupted, you talk about the Never Trumpers, are really the Trump haters.
Right.
Not just within the Republican Party, the entire Democrat establishment, including the media establishment, including academia. Almost to a man and woman, they are lined up, attacking this president because he's a disruptor, correct?
Yeah, and I actually think there's a profound historic reason for that. I think at 8 o'clock on election night, all of those people had a bottle of champagne chilling. They were all going to celebrate breaking the glass ceiling with Hillary. They were going to get radicals appointed to the Supreme Court. And life was good. 2 hours later, it's clear that Hillary's going to lose. And if Hillary's going to lose, that means, oh my God, Donald J. Trump's going to be president. So this 2 hours is the equivalent psychologically of an IED going off. And they get basically the equivalent of PTSD. I mean, these people are all in a state of shock. They try to recover, and this is part of Trump's genius. Every morning they wake up and they think this could be a better day, and then he's already tweeted 6 times before they get awake, and they go, oh my God, he's still president, and they go right back into the PTSD. And so what you've had is a collective psychotic experience by the entire left. We would then get together in sort of therapy support groups called fundraisers and cocktail parties and what have you, and they all talk to each other, and they get hysterical. And so, I mean, Max Boot, who's a good historian, wrote at one point he'd rather vote for Joseph Stalin than for Donald Trump. Now, that is an insane comment. I mean, Stalin killed well over 30 million people, but it was just that sense of the mood and, trying to express how deeply he felt.
When we come back, I'm going to ask you what all of this has to do with the upcoming midterm elections and how you compare this to other midterm elections. Is it as important and consequential as so many people have said, or is it just another election? Ladies and gentlemen, don't forget to watch us on Levin TV almost every weeknight. Just sign up at crtv.com/mark, crtv.com/mark, or give us a call, 844-LEVIN-TV, 844-LEVIN-TV. We'll be right back. Newt Gingrich, this midterm election. What does it have to do with Trump? Does it have everything to do with Trump? And how historic is this midterm election?
Well, I think it's a very historic election because I think Trump is a very historic, disruptive figure. And if at the beginning of the year the great blue wave had actually emerged and they had won the Senate and the House, I think Trump would have been in real trouble, and in a sense he was repudiated. Now, I went out on a limb this week and said, look, I think it is more likely that we will have 57 Republican senators than that Schumer will be the majority leader. Now, that's a conditional bet, but I think that the odds against Schumer are now so bad that and I think we could get as high as 58 or 59, but that would take winning in New Jersey and winning in Minnesota.
It would be a red wave almost.
Well, that would mean if we got that many, it would be a red wave. I think in the House, where we had an unusually large number of retirees, that they're having to fight their way back. But I think with leadership from Kevin McCarthy and Steve Scalise and others, and with a lot of fundraising by Paul Ryan, they're certainly within fighting distance. And I've told people, I think it's probably somewhere between 229 Republican, in which case we'd be a majority, and in a worst case, about 204.
And what is a majority? How many do you need?
218.
218.
And so, and we currently, right now, I think are at 241.
So you're fairly optimistic.
I'm very optimistic in the Senate, and I'm pretty optimistic overall. And I think we still have, almost 10 days to get to the election. And in 2016, we actually got stronger every single day.
Well, the early numbers, and they are that, from NBC, among others, they're looking at a number of these states. And other than Nevada, some of these other states, Georgia, Florida, Texas, Montana, early voting, where they actually monitor it by party, the Republicans are turning out in larger numbers than the Democrats. Now, the independents are turning out too. Who knows how they'll go? What do you make of that?
Well, I think, first of all, there's clearly not going to be a giant blue wave. You also have, in a lot of these states, in Nevada, for example, we have a very important Senate race. I think Dean Heller is going to win. In Arizona, we have a very important Senate race. And this is a good example of what's happening with the Democrats. They nominated a congresswoman named Sinema, who turned out to be a real radical and led anti-war demonstrations in a pink tutu, went on a radio show and said that she thought it was okay for Americans to join the Taliban. And while you could say, well, that was years ago when she was young, she can't bring herself to say she was wrong. I mean, Martha McSally, who's the first American woman in combat as a fighter pilot.
Fighter pilot, yeah.
Has been after her, and McSally keeps drawing the distinction. She said, look, I served with people who were killed by the Taliban. And you can't say it was wrong for an American to join our enemy? And it's almost a Jane Fonda moment for those of us old enough to remember the Vietnam War, where Sinema just can't get off of it. I mean,
why are the Democrats nominating people like this? You look at her, you look at the governorship race in Florida. Gillum is a radical leftist. You look at Georgia, you've got Stacey Abrams. She's a radical leftist.
Right.
This Robert Francis O'Rourke, who likes to be called Beto for some reason, he's a radical. And so they have nominated almost across the board for these statewide offices, these hard left-wing radicals. What's that?
One of my favorite lines was Ted Cruz, who was referring to Comrade Beto.
The party has so fundamental, and people don't notice this, has so fundamentally transformed as an institution.
Yes. I think two things. I think, first of all, a lot of the current hard left was really outlined in a terrific small book by Matt Bai called The Argument. Bai is a New York Times reporter. He wrote it back in 2006, 2007. And it really, in retrospect, I read it at the time, and it sort of indicated Hillary's going to have a hard time. Obama has a small role in the book. You don't see Obama necessarily emerging, but you clearly see that at least half the party opposed Hillary because they thought her husband had sold out. And Clinton had, interestingly, exactly the same experience as his counterpart in Great Britain, in that they both tried to bring their party to the middle. They were both, in the end, repudiated by their party because the left wing of their party was the dominant wing and the wing that has all the energy. And so what's happened is, and then Obama comes along, and Obama's a radical. I mean, the one person I know personally who really got this very early was Sean. I mean, Hannity very early said, look, this guy is exactly out of rules for radicals,
yes,
and exactly represents that kind of radicalism. So he kept the left relatively happy because under the happy face, they knew he was really them. Now, I would say 60% of the Democratic Party today is a radical party. Kevin McCarthy had it exactly right that day when he said, this is now a campaign between America and socialism. It's not between Democrats and Republicans. And I think this is now the Socialist Party of the United States. And you look at places like Venezuela, which is disintegrating, and you have to ask yourself, I mean, how could any rational person favor the kind of socialism that every time it's tried, is a disaster.
So you think this election, like McCarthy, is about Americanism
Yes.
versus socialism?
Which country are we going to be?
And that makes this election historically crucial,
Yes.
because we're on a precipice now making that decision. And they view, I assume, Donald Trump as in the way. They want to remove Donald Trump. They want to repudiate the 2016 election. They want to take one of the instrumentalities of the federal government, so they have a foothold from which, I guess, to spring in 2020 as well. And their entire agenda is sort of political Molotov cocktails. That is, subpoenas, impeachment, slow Trump down, so forth. Well, not really even an agenda that they're prepared to run on. As radical as they are, they're smart enough to try and camouflage their actual views, aren't they?
They are, but I think also, I mean, it's genuine hostility. It's Antifa trashing the Republican Party offices in New York. It's some guys throwing a boulder through Kevin McCarthy's campaign office in California. It's a crowd going in to try to drive the Senate Majority Leader McConnell and his wife out of a restaurant where they're having dinner.
Ted Cruz, so many we can't even name them all.
Yeah, and so you've had this backdrop of growing hostility. And you've had people like Congressman Waters saying, go after them wherever they appear in public, don't let them appear in public, you know, and so forth. And all of that now, we'll see what happens because of the bombs that were mailed, and whether or not suddenly people take a deep breath and begin to lower their voices. But when you have the former Attorney General of the United States say, if the Republicans go low, kick them, and you have Hillary Clinton the other day saying, we can't possibly be civil to these people, there really was a wall that said that Republicans are the other, and our job is to crush them and get rid of them.
When we come back, I want to ask you, what are the big issues in this campaign, and also the media's role leading up to the campaign and today? We'll be right back. You know, I look at the media, and you look at these bomb threats, and you look at Antifa and Black Lives Matter, and how they really have played down Antifa and Black Lives Matter and other radical organizations and the things you listed earlier. And there's a long list of the harassment of Trump officials and Republican officials in restaurants and so forth. And then last week, the president calls himself a nationalist. Now, I'm not a nationalist. I'm a constitutional conservative. But I know what he meant by that. He meant Americanism. America first. And they insinuate or flat out say he's Hitler. He's comparing himself to Hitler, and that Trump is too foolish. He doesn't even know he's comparing himself to Hitler. Well, actually, the new nationalism speech was given by Theodore Roosevelt. It is a progressive part of their ideology, or at least it was. And I'm thinking, how in the world do you compare this president to Hitler and Stalin, and then take from that that he's a racist? He hasn't done anything that suggests that. And so this is a mantra that they keep pushing, a propaganda that they keep pushing. And then I ask myself, are they trying to influence the election? Are they just trying to destroy the man? Are they trying to remove the man? What is your take on this?
Well, I think the level of hostility is beyond anything we've ever seen. I think the last study said 92% of the news media was hostile to Trump, of the actual coverage. You went story by story by story. I think if you were openly pro-Trump in the New York Times newsroom, they'd fire you, or the Washington Post. They would just fire you. They'd say, clearly, you don't understand. You shouldn't be here. I mean, to take the example about what Trump was saying about nationalism, really one of the great magic moments in American history is Benjamin Franklin, who goes to England to represent the colony of Pennsylvania, and after 7 years realizes that he will never be accepted as an Englishman, that the aristocracy simply will not accept him, even though he was a world-famous scientist and a very wealthy man. And people have said he left as a British subject, he came back as an American. And in a way, this thing about being an American starts there. And I think it's important to recognize that what Trump is saying, when he uses the word nationalism, isn't at a level of the federalist, anti-federalist arguments. Right. But it's saying, look, these guys on the left want to basically sell our country out for some kind of global cause, whether it's the Paris Accords or the International Criminal Court or the United Nations. You know, I tell people the reason that John Kerry runs all over the world the way he does, and the reason he still sees the Iranians, is that in Kerry's mind, he was never really the American Secretary of State. He was a world Secretary of State doing good things on behalf of the world. And which is why I don't think you could charge him with the Logan Act, because you'd have to be an American in order to be charged on the Logan Act. And Kerry's not psychologically an American. He's psychologically a person of the globe, and would regard people who care about America as sort of pygmies, you know, obsolete.
Now, the issues in this election, what are the top 2, 3, 4 issues in this right now?
Well, I mean, number one, which doesn't get much coverage because it's working, is the economy. If we didn't have a great economy, the Republicans would be in desperate trouble. But the economy is so good that in district after district, people are saying, no, wait a second. I'm not sure I want to throw out the guy that gave us the lowest black unemployment in history, the lowest Latino unemployment in history, tremendous job growth compared to the last 10 years. Second is a huge...
And by the way, there's very little reporting on that.
Of course, because it's positive. But people know it. People talk about it. They see it in the business news.
They live it.
They live it. The second thing, I think, is the fight that is underway between whether we fix the health system incrementally with practical, common sense steps, or we jump to a government-run big health structure. And there, I think the Democrats made a mistake, because they embraced Medicare for All, which is a great slogan and a terrible program. And as a result, it's been torn apart. The president himself wrote a tremendous op-ed, I think in USA Today, just taking it apart. And Republicans have figured out how to sort of make sure people understood this socialist idea means you lose your health care.
Let me just stop in this before we get to the Green. Because Medicare for All means Medicare for nobody.
Right, that's right.
It's government-run, centralized, old Soviet-style health care.
And seniors have begun to figure out that this Medicare for All thing means you're going to take away my Medicare. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a dead loser for the Democrats, which it wasn't when they first said it. Mm-hmm. But as the argument goes on, they're losing. I think the other two are Kavanaugh, because I think what happened with Judge Kavanaugh galvanized the right, reminded people how radical the Democrats are. And for the Senate races was devastating, because it reminded people that this is a team sport. So if you watch, Manchin, who is personally pretty popular in West Virginia, is now behind. And the reason he's behind is people figured out he's going to go back and vote for Schumer. Well, don't tell me you're a conservative if you're going to go back and vote for Schumer. So the reminder out of the Kavanaugh fight that this is a team sport was particularly badly timed for all the Democrats running in states that Trump carried.
And it brought all the factions of the Republican Party together, which is
and energized them immensely. And then lastly, I think, is the caravans. I think when you start seeing footage, and it's one of those cases where the news media can't say enough to undo what you're watching with your own eyes. You see 7,000 to 15,000 people, almost all of them male, coming north. That looks like an invasion. It doesn't look like a family reunion. And I think the result has been that the country is really debating immigration now, and it's front and center in a way that is very much the disadvantage of Democrats who just can't cope with it.
Don't forget, ladies and gentlemen, almost every weeknight you can watch Levin TV. That's me, by the way. Levin TV on crtv.com/Mark, crtv.com/Mark. We'd love you to sign up there, or give us a call at 844-LEVIN-TV, 844-LEVIN-TV. We'll be right back. Newt Gingrich, let's look at a couple of these races that come to mind. Let's take a look at Florida. Now, Florida's the third most populated state. It's crucial for Republicans. You start losing states like Florida, you can't win. If you lose Texas and Florida, there's no way you can win a presidential election. But these are very, very important states. You've got a governorship race there, Ron DeSantis and Andrew Gillum. Ron DeSantis is a war veteran. He's a Harvard graduate. He served a brief time in Congress, but he's shown himself to be a leader, a solid conservative, a Trump supporter. You have Gillum, the mayor of Tallahassee. It's a corrupt city. The murder rate's through the roof. He pushes taxes through the roof. He was Bernie Sanders' candidate. He's worked for People for the American Way, Norman Lear. He's backed by George Soros. And I watched this debate last night, and he keeps bringing up race. He's under investigation, among others, by the FBI, and he says it's because of race. What is your comment on that?
Well, I think, first of all, most people in this day and age, when they have a guy stand there and say, I had to take the tickets to Hamilton, which were, by the way, I think $1,800 a piece, because I was black. But what is he saying to us? I mean, that it was okay to be corrupt if you're black, or that it's not corrupt by definition if you're black because it's never corrupt. Then it turns out that he also took a trip to the Central America with the same FBI guy. And you have to say to yourself, so you shouldn't be held accountable for anything you do because you're black? And I think it actually is a disservice to every African American in the country to have a politician at that level who, faced with their own personal corruption, hides behind the issue of race. Because then, I mean, he's in one level, he's sort of smearing every single person who's African American. And that's just wrong. This is about him personally.
I agree with that. I mean, it had nothing to do with race. It was an undercover FBI agent. They're investigating a corrupt city, and they're investigating the mayor as part of it. And the fact is, he took the tickets to Hamilton, which he didn't pay for. The taxpayer paid for it. And the fact is, he took the hotel room. And the fact is, he went to Costa Rica. It's nothing to do with race, and I agree. To bring that up is really a disservice to African Americans, but it's a disservice to the people of Florida, too, to play that kind of game. And the media has largely, the national media, not the local media, has let them off the hook. Let's take a look at another race. We have Texas. Ted Cruz seems to be doing much better now against Robert Francis O'Rourke. I won't call him Beto. That's his deal. He can call himself Beto all he wants. But O'Rourke, he's another guy who's hardcore leftist. He was a leftist for a few years, representing El Paso in the House of Representatives. He's backed by Hollywood. He's backed by Manhattan. He's backed by the usual leftists and billionaires and so forth. What do you make of that race?
Well, Texas is a place where liberal hearts get broken.
Yeah.
I mean, 4 years ago it was Wendy Davis. She was the great hope. She was going to bring them a governor as a liberal Democrat. She crashed and burned. It's going to be doubly interesting in O'Rourke's case because he has raised so much money. I think he's raised $68 million.
Unbelievable.
If he loses with $68 million, at some point there's going to be kind of buyer's remorse.
They're already talking him up for 2020 presidential run.
Which you have
bizarre.
To think, well, works for me. I mean, you have to think that's it's kind of bizarre. He started this race, and in midsummer, it looked like he was going to be a serious candidate. But Texas is a conservative state. Cruz is a very smart, effective guy. And you got back down to basic issues. You know, gun control, right to life, balancing the budget, smaller government, the kind of things where left-wing Democrats don't do very well.
Let me give you one more. I got 1 minute on this. Stacey Abrams against Kemp in Georgia, another radical.
Sure. Well, I think in the end Stacey Abrams loses because she's both a radical and she is totally Atlanta. She has no idea about the state outside of Atlanta. And I think that it's beginning to be clear, whereas Brian Kemp, as Secretary of State, represents the whole state, my guess is he'll win by 4 to 6 points.
Michigan, John James, a wonderful candidate, African-American, combat veteran, successful small businessman, gets almost no national attention, CNN, MSNBC, all but ignore him. Debbie Stabenow.
If he gets enough money in the next week, and if there are a couple of breaks, he'll win. The most recent poll that just came out showed the governor's race much closer, the lieutenant governor's race much closer. I mean, everything in Michigan is coming together and getting much, much tighter. That would be one of the biggest upsets, but he's such an attractive candidate and has such a great background. And Stabenow's been around a long time.
He really is a great candidate. 10 seconds. McCaskill, Hawley, Missouri.
Hawley's going to win handily because McCaskill made a comment that she didn't need any of rural Missouri as long as she carried St. Louis. There ain't enough votes in St. Louis.
And she can only conceal her left-wing beliefs so long in a state like Missouri, and at this point, she's been unable to conceal them. We'll be right back. Newt Gingrich, it's election night. We're watching the returns. Are there a couple of states, a couple of House races that we should keep our eye on to get a feel for what might be trending?
Well, I think in the House, if you look at Barbara Comstock in Northern Virginia and Dave Bratt down around Richmond, those two races are really important signals. And if the Republicans keep both of them, there is no possibility the Democrats get control of the House. If we lose both of them, then it could be a really long night. And I think that they're really central as a weather vane of what's going to happen. I think in the Senate on the east side, Bob Hugin is running a great race in New Jersey. It's a long shot race. If he's winning in New Jersey election night, it's going to be a really long night for the Democrats.
Let's say he loses and it's close.
Well, then
night?
It's potentially going to be a long night because then you go further west where Karen Housey, for example, is running against the appointed replacement for Al Franken. And because of the impact of Ellison, who has had all sorts of problems, he's dragging the entire ticket down. And there's a real chance there. And Trump's been out on the Iron Range, which is the area in northern Minnesota that used to be very Democrat, and now it's become very Republican. So Minnesota is a state that is in a process of really dramatic change, I think. If we win that Senate seat, it'll be, for Schumer, a devastating night.
Now, you know, these votes come in on the East Coast. They start to spread towards the Midwest, then they go to the West, then to the far West, and you have California where there's 6 or 7 races there that Republicans have held, where they're really tight races. I mean, a couple of points apart. You've got Rohrabacher, Hunter, a few of the other seats. You've got chairmen who've retired. I think, tell me if you agree, I think what the media will do in this country is the report in such a way, quote unquote, is to try and get the Democrats out, try and get the Democrat base out, because they know if it's close, they need those 6 or 7 California seats to put the Democrats over the top. Am I being too cynical or am I being realistic?
No, that's exactly how it works. I mean, I remember in 2000, they would hold up states that were going for Bush and not call them, while they were calling states that were going for Gore. And so early in the evening, they were giving you this impression of a totally one-sided election for Gore. And then later in the evening, all of these states, which they knew, and they just hadn't reported them, they knew were going to go for Bush, started piling on. So yeah, I think it's very hard to overstate the depth of bias in most of the news media against Trump and against the Republicans.
So you agree with me then, that if the Republicans seem to be holding on, or actually better, they don't want to deflate the voters out west where they need those key House districts, those races, and they'll try and pump them up somehow.
Well, what happened in '80 when Reagan won so decisively, and Jimmy Carter conceded too early. He conceded while California was still voting. And the result was that we picked up several seats because people were listening on their portable radios back then, and they heard that Carter had conceded, and the Democrats went home. And the Republicans stayed because they wanted to vote for the winner.
We'll be right back. You know, it's possible if the Democrats take the House, even by a little, and they overreach, and there's subpoenas everywhere, and they're trashing the president, they want his tax returns, the tax returns of his grandchildren, and on and on and on. Or they're bringing up articles of impeachment. Isn't it possible, like the Kavanaugh hearings and so much more that the Democrats do, that they're going to walk into the door? That is, there'll be a great backlash in America that would actually help Trump's reelection in 2020?
I think it's very possible. I also think it's very possible the Democratic Party will just split between the hardliners who are rabid and want to go and bite Trump's ankle, and the more moderate ones who just think we got to do something positive before the 2020 election. So I could imagine House Democrats being bitterly split.
And you would have people like Nadler, who's a leftist, heading the Judiciary Committee. You would have Maxine Waters heading the Finance Committee. I mean, it'd be hard to conceal who they really are, wouldn't they? Because the leftists from the deepest of blue parts of the deepest of blue states, they have no reason to control themselves.
Well, and remember, they then hire staff who are even more radical than they are.
Right.
That's how Feinstein ended up with a bill that's an open borders bill that every single Democrat incumbent co-sponsored in the Senate, because her staff is so far to the left, it didn't even occur to them that an open border bill is crazy.
It's a pleasure, Newt.
Good to be with you.
God bless. Join us next time on Life, Liberty, and Levin.